back up the audience who's here, and I'll probably ignore you and talk to these guys. Yeah, it's just really nice to be back in the Great Hall talking about the Dharma, and particularly this evening, I'm excited because I'm going to be talking about the Buddha and his life. So I don't know if you know, but I used to work for Still Learning, which is the education service here, and during the time I worked for that, which was about 9 years or 10 years or something, I don't know how many times I told the Buddha's life story. It was probably into the hundreds, definitely. I was wondering, was it into the thousands? But I never got bored of telling it because it's just it's such a fantastic story. And I always feel goosebumps coming in my neck when I was telling it. And we had the picture and I'd tell the kids and they were all like, oh, this is so amazing. So it is amazing. So I'm really happy that I can be talking about it this evening to adults this time, which is great. And of course, I'm going to be talking about the life in the Buddha in the context of spiritual death, particularly. And following on from the fantastic talk Sangha Gita gave us last week, setting up spiritual death. So, of course, we have, just to briefly recap, we have the stage of integration first. So we become a sort of together being with all of the different parts of ourselves all going in roughly the same direction. We then develop, or at the same time, we're developing positive emotions. So contacting these trying to establish a deep well of metta, which then develops into joy and compassion and equanimity. So these things are really important, and we become this happy, healthy human being. And then that happy, healthy human being has to die because something else needs to emerge. So let's see how that plays itself out in the life of the Buddha. So just a bit about the Buddha, in case you don't know. So his name was probably Siddhartha Gautama, and he lived around 500 years before the Common Era. And his family were quite a high caste. They were Kshatriya, it's hard to say, Kshatriya class. It's like a warrior caste. And he was a particularly privileged young man because his father was quite powerful. So he lived this very privileged and sheltered upbringing. I want to read you a bit out of the Pali Canon where he describes his upbringing because I just think it's fantastic. He said, I was delicate, most delicate, supremely delicate. Lily pools were made for me at my father's house solely for my benefit. I used no sandalwood that was not from Benares. My turban, tunic, lower garments and cloak were all made of Benares cloth. A white sunshade was held over me day and night so that no heat or dust or grit or dew might inconvenience me. I had 3 palaces, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rains. In the rains palace, I was entertained by minstrels with no men among them. So he obviously had quite a nice time in his palaces. And he lived like this until the age of 29, very shielded from the inconveniences and suffering in life. But although he was living in the midst of this, heavenly existence, really, something was amiss for Siddhartha. And he says, he thought, whilst I had such power and good fortune, yet I thought, when an ordinary, untaught man who is subject to aging, not safe from aging, sees another who is aged, he is shocked, humiliated, and disgusted, for he forgets that he himself is no exception. But I too am subject to aging, not safe from aging, and so it cannot befit me to be shocked, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another who is aged. When I considered this, the vanity of youth entirely left me. So it seems as if he had this sudden realization that despite all of his wealth and luxury and privilege and status, he was not safe from old age. These old people, they weren't just something else. They were what he was going to become. And he suddenly realized this, and the vanity of youth left him. And he went on to reflect in the same way about sickness and about death. And the vanity of health and of life also left him, he says. And he was left with this deep existential question. Why, being myself subject to birth, aging, ailment, death, sorrow, and defilement, do I seek after what is also subject to these things? What am I doing? Why am I going for refuge to these things that can never satisfy me? So I just want to pause in the story there and consider this, which I think is Siddhartha's first big, huge spiritual death experience. So he's been living this lovely life for 29 years, and I imagine he was a fairly happy, healthy human being, had quite a nice time. He hadn't had much suffering in his life. And then suddenly seeing that wasn't going to do it. None of these external things could protect him from suffering at all. And so this deep questioning arose about his life. Why am I seeking after these things? And I can only imagine how painful and frightening that must have been for him. That was all he knew. And then suddenly he realized, well, no, it's not going to work anymore. So questioning how these things could bring in the satisfaction they had before. So that's, a really huge spiritual death, really. It's the death of a man who is previously content and oblivious and satisfied. And so he was left dissatisfied with his life. And I really want to pick up on this dissatisfaction, this quality of dissatisfaction, which Bhante Sangha brings out as a really positive quality that we should cultivate, which might sound a bit weird as Buddhists, we're supposed to be cultivating this positive emotion. But actually, he said, it is really positive as long as we are cultivating dissatisfaction rather than just sort of a grumbly, moany sort of being miffed sort of thing. Bhante talks about genuine dissatisfaction as a genuine and creative mood of inner revolt, which I think is fantastic. Creative mood of inner revolt. It's wonderful. So a deep sense of really knowing and really understanding this isn't enough. This isn't right. It's got to change. We've gone as far as we can with something, but it's not enough. No, not anymore. And maybe that thing is pleasant. Maybe it's safe. Maybe we've been told that this thing should be enough for us, and maybe it even has been enough for us, but now it isn't. And I suspect that this is something we can all relate to in one way or another. It might not be as grand as what Siddhartha experienced. Recognizing that some aspect of our life, small or big, just isn't really working, isn't really satisfying us in the way that we'd hoped for or we longed for, and that we've been looking for the wrong sort of happiness in the wrong place. And I imagine if we hadn't had this sort of dissatisfaction, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have come to the Buddhist Centre looking for something with a deeper meaning, something different to what we knew. And that might have been triggered for some of us by really big events, huge events like death and serious illness and accidents and things like that. They can trigger a sort of similar existential crisis to one that Siddhartha faced. And I know that when friends of around my own age have died, then an echo of what Siddhartha experienced, I have experienced, thinking suddenly, oh, death isn't just this thing that's going to happen at some point in the future. I could die now. Death is now potentially. And the vanity of life leaves me. So the assumption that I will continue to live leaves me. And suddenly I become dissatisfied with all the frivolous and pointless ways that I spend my time and refocus my energy in a more fruitful and meaningful way. Sadly, I lose, the vanity of life reappears and I carry on as I was, but these moments, they happen. Or it might be smaller things that trigger some sense of dissatisfaction. So I was thinking, what's a good example of this? And I remembered when I used to work in the Evolution gift shop with Sankita and loads of other people on screen up there. And we had a good time. And we used to stand behind the counter when there was no one to serve, and I would just look around the shop to see if there's anything that needed tidying up. And as I did so, I would look at the stock, and if there was anything I liked and I wanted to buy, and I would imagine having that thing and wanting these things and how that would change my life. And I remember there was one day, there was this big display of bags. I remember it right, it was just over there, and it was right across the wall. And I was just in, oh, this bag or that bag. And then I suddenly had the thought, none of these bags will make any difference to my life at all. I'll be exactly the same and I will have a bag. That suddenly struck me that I'd been imagining that this bag would change my life in some way, on some level. And it might sound really silly, but in that moment, it wasn't just about bags. It was about everything. It was about all things that I was thinking that were things that would make a big difference to my life and my deep happiness. That mistake I was constantly making. So, yes. So it's quite scary, actually, in a certain way. It's quite exhilarating, though. I think, oh, well, if none of these things are going to do it, I've been a Buddhist for a while by then, but still, these things take time to go in, don't they? So I did find, actually, that dissatisfaction a very positive thing. It was quite exhilarating because it did align me with the way that things were. although, it was a bit uncomfortable. I think the problem with staying with this true sense of dissatisfaction with things is that it's easy to slide off onto disgruntlement, which is what Bhante compares it to. Disgruntlement is such a great word as well. And I think this is partly because I think, well, it's inherently painful, isn't it, to be disappointed. So, really staying with a sense of disappointment and really kind of dwelling on what that means is going to be quite uncomfortable and painful, and we might not want to do that. So I know that can cause me to slide off dissatisfaction onto disgruntlement. Or also, if I do really take on what that means, then I have to do something about it, and that takes effort. And also that's difficult. So again, easier just to be disgruntled, a bit miffed. So maybe we remain disgruntled. That's what we choose to do. We think, well, this bag's not going to do. You get the bag. Oh, the bag's not changed my life. I'll get another bag. This phone's not changed my life. I'll get another phone. Or what about another relationship? What about if I change my job? What about if I get a new house? This is just being disgruntled with life, not really seeing into, well, the problem is much deeper than that, isn't it? The problem is our entire attitude to these things, that we think they're going to make us happy in that deep, deep way. And it's a real missed opportunity, because if there's something in life that's not delivering what we hoped, and we really look into that, well, that's where insight lies, isn't it? Because it's not until we really open up to the truth that these things can never really satisfy us, that then we have the courage and the energy and the motivation to do something different, look somewhere else, and really, really engage with the Dharma life. Clock, thank you very much. Great, so that's the first bit of the story. So then, of course, what happens is on the basis of this deep realization, this spiritual death, Siddhartha realized that he can't continue living this life as he was living before. Just gonna have a quick drink. He said, suppose being myself subject to these things, which is death and aging and all those things, seeing danger in them, I sought after the unborn, unaging, deathless, sorrowless, undefiled, supreme surcease in bondage, nibbana. So nibbana is another word. It means the same as nirvana in Sanskrit, and it sort of means the extinguishing, and we'd call it maybe enlightenment is the word we'd usually give that. So this is his answer to his existential question, that he needs to attain enlightenment. That's the only answer that he can see. And to do that, he's going to leave everything that he's known behind, and he's going to go forth from the household life into homelessness. So he does that, and he leaves the palace, and he changes out of his beautiful clothes into a beggar's rags, and he cuts his beautiful warrior's hair all off and becomes a bareheaded, rag-dressed mendicant. And that's the last time he ever lives in a house. So I just want to draw out from this little portion of the story the importance of conditions in terms of spiritual death. It's very hard to imagine that if Siddhartha had this realization, but then just stayed in the palace with his minstrels and his sandalwood, that he would have become the Buddha. He needed to do something. He needs to go forth from those conditions and be in a different place, in different surroundings, to change in the way that he needed to change. He couldn't change in that way, in those old conditions. Because the conditions that we put ourselves in are crucial for spiritual death, not just for him, but for us as well. The conditions we choose for, we don't choose all our conditions, but a lot of our conditions we do choose, and we have power over. And some of the conditions we choose for ourselves, like the activities and hobbies we engage in, the people we surround ourselves with, the place we live, the job we do, all these sorts of things, they all have the potential to restrict our growth or to encourage it. And we have a lot of power over that. And I imagine that none of us are going to don robes and become wandering mendicants. So our going forth is going to look a lot different from Siddhartha's, but still important for us to consider the conditions that we're in, that we put ourselves in, and whether they are supportive or not of our Dharma lives. So this is probably going to look very different for everybody, and also it'll look different for each one of us at different times in our life, as I'll talk about in a little while. So it might look like just spending more time with Sangha friends who are going to encourage growth in a positive direction, because our Sangha friends share our deepest ideals and they'll be able to relate to us in terms of our potential and who we can become. Or it might mean that we have to let go or move away from or limit certain habits or situations that we put ourselves in, things that are holding us back. So jobs, like I say, jobs, people, activities, those sorts of things. Sometimes, if we're really honest with ourselves, we know that certain things are not good for us. They're not helping us. It might look like going on retreat. This is a real good one that probably a lot of you have done. A lot of us were on the Sangha retreat the weekend, which is fantastic. And especially when you can get away on residential retreats where you really do go forth from everything that you know and you're in completely different conditions for a little while. And it's really interesting to see what emerges in the space that you put there, you know, when you take away all your normal stuff. So these aspects of, so something you could maybe discuss in the groups actually might be something about, well, is there anything that I have left behind yet? It might be very small, it might be quite big, because you realised it wasn't serving you anymore. Or it might be something which is currently life for you, where you feel it's not serving you and you want to make some change in a particular direction. So it might be something you could consider in the groups, something you want to go forth from. So this is really important, but in terms of the life of Siddhartha, these things are, and our lives as well, I suppose, these things are really only external supports for the real going forth, which is a more internal affair. It's the shedding of old ways of being, of self-views, of identities. And in relation to this, I've always been really fascinated by the bit where he cuts his hair off and puts new clothes on. And I see this as the moment where he really sheds his identity as a powerful Kshatriya and becomes a beggar. It's very, very stark, you know. You can just imagine him, can't you, getting out of his things and putting them on. I mean, I had a similar experience when I dressed to get ordained as well. I wore blue the whole time. But my first experience in this sort of way that Siddhartha had was back in 2010. So some of you who were around back then will remember that before that point, I had really long dreadlocks, which I loved. I loved my dreadlocks. They were beautiful. And I had had them for 9 years by this point. I'd had them all through my 20s when I was cool. I was in a band. I used to go clubbing. I was very interesting, obviously, and as you are when you're in your 20s, and you know, well, you know, that's what that was the identity, wasn't it? And then one day, and then in that New Year, Christmas New Year, I went to Tiwatnaloka, which is the ordination centre training women for ordination, and I remember that you know, there was like 30 of us or so, and we were going around, and everyone was introducing themselves. And one of the order members there on the team, she was writing down a note next to everyone's name to remember who they were. And I just happened to be standing, I don't know how this happened, but I managed to be standing like just behind her or sitting above her or something. And I noticed she wrote my name down, and next to it she put dreadlocks. And I just thought, I don't want to be identified by my hair. That's just not good enough. I realised that not only was I being identified by my hair, I was sort of identifying myself by my hair. I was hiding behind that as an identity. And part of it was this identity of, you know, being cool and interesting, which I associated with having dreadlocks, you know, back from when I was younger. And I realised that I wasn't entirely convinced that without my hair, there would be anything left. I didn't think I would be at all cool or interesting without my dreadlocks. And the other thing I realised was that I was holding on to some old identity of myself when I was younger, where before I became ill with ME, when I was fun and had lots of energy, and I was sort of clinging onto that through my hair a little bit. And once I realised those things, I just thought, I can't go on with having this hair. So on that retreat, one of my friends cut off my dreadlocks, which was quite extreme and very, very exhilarating in the way I described before, where there was this freedom of being released from all of the identities and the ways that I'd sort of been defining myself by my haircut. And it really, so it did feel really freeing and also challenging, because it really challenged my view of myself, that there was nothing really intrinsically interesting about myself, in and of myself, that I needed hair to be interesting. Obviously, I took that quite far because now I have no hair. Another story. I mean, it's so easy, isn't it, to get attached to the groups we're part of. So easy. You know, the identities that we have. You know, we're left wing, we're right wing, we're working class, we're middle class, we're British, we're teachers, we're doctors, we're not teachers or doctors, we're arty, we're not arty, we're musical, not musical. I get this a lot when I'm teaching piano. Well, I'm not musical. We're Buddhists. You know, these are all labels, and the problem with them is that they turn us from being a noun, from being a verb into being a noun. They turn us from being a process into being a thing, a stuck thing. So every time we're willing to step outside these identities, like Siddhartha did, and maybe like I did in a small way, then that is an aspect of spiritual death. Right, let's get on with it. Okay, leaving the groups. So this is the last bit I'm going to talk about in his life. So Siddhartha wandered around and he searched for his answer for the next 6 years. And during that time, he studied under 2 separate teachers, and they were both quite highly attained, although not enlightened. And he studied with them and quite quickly attained all of their attainments. And they were so impressed that the first one asked him if he would co-lead the group, and the second one asked if he would just take over the group because he was so great. But each time Siddhartha realized, well, no, this isn't enlightenment. This isn't what I'm looking for. So he just carried on. So he left that promise of fame and that praise and that status. He just kept leaving it behind. He was so focused on what he wanted to achieve. And then he took on ascetic practices where you're you're harsh to the body, sort of starving yourself and sitting under the sun and in fires and things. And he became really, really good at that. Like, he was so hardcore that people just started following him to copy him because he was so great. So he got a bit of a following there. But then at some point he just realized, you know, he was almost dying. He was almost dead. And he realized that wasn't really helping him. So he stopped doing those things because he was, you know, very committed. But those people, they just left him. They thought he'd gone soft and they just abandoned him in disgust. So I think it's really amazing that he never settled. Like, in all that time, he didn't allow himself to be sidetracked by the promise of an easier life, you know, still living a fairly spiritual life, you know, but comfortable and well thought of, with lots of praise and people bringing him food and, you know, all that jazz. And he was willing to go forth from those things again and again, even when it exposed him to the ridicule and rejection of people that he was associating with. And I do think it's worth acknowledging that spiritual death and change will not always make us the most popular person in the world, you know, especially when we go against conventions, against societal norms, against what our friends and family want from us or might expect from us or how we've been before. It's actually a very subversive thing to do, to engage in a project of self-development and change and transformation and enlightenment. So I think that's one of the main reasons, really, why I think it's important to remain in good contact with the Sangha, because, as I said before, those are the people who will really support that process when other people can't. It's also not going to always be the most comfortable or safe choice. So if Siddhartha had settled for less, yeah, he would have had this nice life, but he didn't. He remained faithful to his ideals. And often this will mean that we have to keep letting go of things that we tried that are no longer serving us. You know, we have to accept, well, we're wrong. We have to admit that we're wrong. I mean, it's so hard, isn't it, to say that we're wrong. We've been trying something, actually, we got it wrong. It's very humiliating. Obviously, he was a very strong person. He could do that again and again. And that's why positive emotion is so important, and integration. I, personally speaking, had quite a number of years working for the movement in the centre particularly, and living in community, which I loved and was really, really good for me and a fantastic thing to do. And I changed massively during the time that I did that. And then I changed so much it became not the wisest choice for me anymore. And I needed other conditions to further my growth. But I found that so hard to accept. I found it very, very difficult to, because I was so invested in that version of myself, in that way of practicing and how my practice should look in that way. And it was humiliating how hard I found that and how long it took me to act on that realization, because I recognized that I was using the spiritual life, ironically, as a way to stay safe and not change, which is obviously not what it's designed for. So so I did eventually leave those situations, but I think that was probably, I don't know, but like possibly one of the biggest spiritual deaths of my life, where I really had to see the whole of my expectations of what the Dharma life should be crumble into dust and rebuild from there. And I must say, it's done me a lot of good. But yeah, not a nice experience. And it really taught me how important it is to surround ourselves with our spiritual friends and to cultivate positive emotion, so that when something like that does happen and we do change and things do have to break apart, as they always do, that we have enough strength and robustness to be creative in the space that opens up. So that's I think that's as far as we'll go. We're going to leave Siddhartha. He's finished. He doesn't know what to do. What's going to happen next? Who knows? Come back next week. Satyajoti will finish the story, which will take us onto the biggest spiritual death of all, which is, of course, the enlightenment.